There's the leap that I want to call into question, because I think that that is an unfair charge. Now, one of the things that, for instance, Scott Clark does in his published writings, when he wants to criticize Reformed Baptists, he'll use something that he calls the time machine test. Perhaps you've heard of that. Or excuse me, sorry, I'm calling it the time machine test. Those are my quote marks, not his. I don't want to wrongly attribute anything to him. But I'm calling it the time machine test. And what does he do? Well, he gives this thought experiment, right? And he says, okay, imagine a group of 21st century Reformed Baptists like we have here this morning. Well, I assume everyone's Reformed Baptist. If you're not, you can exclude yourself from this thought experiment. But assume we all are here. Imagine that this room was a time machine. Sort of has a futuristic feel. This isn't too hard to imagine. And we transport ourselves back to the mid-17th century. We're there in the 1640s, and we walk out of the building, and we make our way to the Westminster Assembly, and we expect to be greeted warmly because we're Reformed, they're Reformed. But Clark says, no, one cannot doubt that our time travelers would return home disappointed to be rejected by the Westminster Assembly. He said they would be rejected by the Synod of Dort. Were they to try again at the Westminster Assembly, they would find a similarly chilly reception. And so Clark concludes from that, he says, if our young, restless, and Reformed theologians could not find hospitality at Dort or Westminster, we may fairly ask whether the adjective Reformed is properly used of them. All right. So putting aside, again, for a moment, the point that we're actually not talking about this sort of generic young, restless Reformed crowd. We're actually talking about a rather specific group of churches that subscribe to a rather specific confession. Putting that aside, I think initially this time machine test seems plausible. There's a plausibility to it, right? You say you're Reformed, and yet you go back to the Westminster Assembly. They don't want anything to do with you. How can you maintain that you're, in a meaningful way, Reformed? That makes sense. All right. So why then were they so keen on rejecting believers' baptism? One, because believers' baptism is associated with Anabaptists in Germany who are up to all sorts of trouble. And two, because at that time, to accept believers' baptism would threaten the whole logic of the state church and this comprehensive Christian nation that they were trying to build. And so what we see then is that when we read early modern sources and they reject the very idea that anyone who accepts believers' baptism could ever be a part of their assembly, we have to recognize that the vehemence and the force and the vigor with which they reject the Baptistic position has nothing to do with theological concerns strictly conceived. The vehemence, the intensity, the force is being driven by these other things that have to do with Anabaptists in Munster and a state church, neither of which are our concerns today when we relate to our Presbyterian brothers and sisters like Scott Clark. So it's anachronistic, I think, then, to take the vehemence of their rejections and read that back on to our present-day situation. And that's a big problem. Secondly, though, we should recognize that the time machine test is also unhelpful for another reason. And namely, that very few individuals living today could ever possibly pass it. Very few in the 21st century West, no matter how truly Reformed they might claim to be, could actually pass the time machine test. It's a lot harder than maybe it initially appears, and it goes well beyond whether or not you accept infant baptism. What are we talking about? Well, think about this. What would the Westminster Divines think of a contingent of time-traveling Presbyterian ministers who claimed faithfulness to the Reformed tradition, and yet they denied the civil magistrate a sufficiently robust role in affirming and furthering godly religion? They questioned the wisdom of the regulative principle, and they scrupled the morally binding nature of the fourth commandment. And that's to say nothing of the conflicts that would certainly arise when our hypothetical Presbyterian time travelers got around to sharing their controversial views on things like the Pope's relationship to the Antichrist, the appropriate use of lots, and questions like this one. Can an infant of unbelieving parents be baptized on the merits of a godly great-grandfather? See, today, if you go into a Paedo-Baptist Presbyterian church and they're strict about it and they subscribe to Westminster Assembly, If you want to have a baby baptized, then normally the parents, of course, need to be believers, or at least one of the parents needs to be a believer, right? That confers a federal holiness on the baby, and the baby is a fit subject for baptism. But if you go back to the 17th century, you will find that in their desire to establish a truly Christian nation in the strong sense, they were happy enough to baptize anyone, regardless of the baby's parents. So here's a quote from Samuel Rutherford. So the Scottish Commissioner of the Westminster Assembly, Samuel Rutherford, this is not sort of some obscure figure I've picked out. Samuel Rutherford says, "I think Scripture saith here with us that the nearest parents be not the only conveyors of federal holiness." He says that we also affirm that the Lord extendeth the mercy of the covenant to 1,000 generations, and therefore the line of covenant mercy is not broken off for the unbelief of the nearest parents. So again, this is Samuel Rutherford in his due right of presbyteries. He's defending his whole ecclesiological system. He's not an obscure figure, and he's very, very happy to basically baptize any infant as long as within 1,000 generations you can produce a believer. So, in other words then, to borrow Clarke's own standard, if our time-traveling contingent of PCA ministers could not, to quote him, could not find hospitality at Dort or Westminster, might we not, quoting him again, fairly ask whether the adjective reformed is properly used of them? And again, the point is not to criticize these imaginary Presbyterian ministers, but rather it's simply to suggest that if the legitimate heirs of the Reformed tradition are only those to whom early modern Protestants would have offered a warm and full-throated welcome, then we will find the truly Reformed to be a very small group indeed.